Hi, welcome back to Justice Talks True Crime. Today we're going to be talking about Chester Klingel Jr. This is the second episode in my series on Klingel. Today I want to talk about his knowledge set. Because the Zodiac killer displayed some level of firearms knowledge, he used at least 3 separate guns in his 4 different crimes. He also directly mentioned the Gun Control Act of 1968 in a letter, saying that he had purchased his killing tools through the mail before the ban, and one out of state after the ban. Chester Klingel was a known gun lover. He was in the ROTC Rifle Club in high school. He placed in the top 5 in rifle shooting and the top 10 in pistol shooting. There was even a joke in the local paper under the section People You Know that said, Chester Klingel has fallen in love with a .22 rifle he purchased recently. So he was a known gun lover at the time. He was also a lifelong Republican whose parents were very involved in Republican politics, and a member of the American Legion. And as somebody who's politically engaged, no doubt would have known about the Gun Control Act of 1968. The Zodiac killer also displayed some level of sewing ability. According to Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim at Lake Berryessa, the third attack, the Zodiac killer's costume had been neatly sewn, including a neatly sewn-on cross on the chest. When Klingel was growing up, his family home hosted monthly meetings of the Altar Guild, which was a sewing group for the Episcopal Church. It's very possible that he helped out with this sewing group. He also had opportunities to learn about sewing in the Boy Scouts and in the Army. In the Boy Scouts, he may also have learned some knot tying. The Zodiac killer displayed some level of electronics knowledge when he made electrical diagrams of what he said would be his bomb. Chester Klingel was a radar technician in the Army, and he was trained for 8 months in general electronics as well as radar electronics. He was stationed at the Presidio Army Base as a radar technician, and then stationed at Hanford Plutonium Works, developing oscilloscopes, which displays some heightened level of electrical knowledge. After the Army, he was a junior engineer at North American Aviation. So I think he would be perfectly capable of making these electrical diagrams. These bomb diagrams also mention ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And Chester Klingel was a farmer. Or I should say very specifically, he had a farm in the Amargosa Desert in order to keep a farm alive in the middle of the desert. I think he would know his way around some fertilizer. This was so far in the middle of nowhere in the desert that it didn't have a legal address. It was only legally defined by its point along the Mount Diablo meridian. And I know some of your brains are going off and you're saying, hey, wait a minute, Mount Diablo? Didn't Zodiac use Mount Diablo for his Z32 code for the Phillips 66 map? And, of course, yes, he did. And he was talking about radians to do with Mount Diablo, or potentially to do with Mount Diablo in that case. And the author Michael Cole pointed out that on that same Phillips 66 map, Zodiac has marked the compass 0 to 11. And he says that has something to do with celestial navigation. I would say celestial navigation is a huge part of nautical navigation, because when you're in the middle of the ocean, the only landmarks that you have are in the sky. And Chester Klingel was crew on a Navy ship as a merchant marine, where he may have been taught celestial navigation, as most people in the Navy are. He was crew on the Matthew P. Deedy Liberty ship. And if you're a big history buff, then you'll know the Matthew P. Deedy Liberty ship was kamikaze attacked by the Japanese in the Battle of the Philippines in November of 1944. Now, the Zodiac had mentioned slaves in the afterlife, this idea that if he killed people, then they would become his slave in the afterlife. The police at the time thought this might have something to do with Filipino folklore, And I would say that it's a fundamental misunderstanding of Filipino folklore because in ancient Filipino folklore, there was stories about people's possessions being brought with them to the afterlife, and you could sacrifice their slaves to send them to the afterlife with them. But there was nothing about how if you killed someone, they would become your slave in the afterlife. But I did think, could this have been an exaggeration, sort of a campfire story version of Filipino folklore that Chester Klingel picked up when he was talking to other people about the Battle of the Philippines? And he was also in the Army on the USAT General Brewster when he was stationed in Guam. And there would have been other people on that ship, and in fact there was other people on that ship who were stationed in the Philippines. And could they have been sitting around talking about Filipino folklore, and he picks up some distorted version of Filipino folklore? I don't know. But after he was stationed in Guam, he was sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, which is where he was trained for 8 months in electronics. And some people think there's a linguistic connection to Texas in the Zodiac case, because on March 13th of 1971, the Zodiac killer sent a letter to the LA Times in which he said, the longer the police fiddle and fart around, he used the term fiddle and fart around. And some people thought this phrase comes from northern Texas. And I think this training at Fort Bliss would be a perfect opportunity for him to overhear one of the instructors say, "Are y'all just going to fiddle and fart around, or are you going to get back to work?" Anyway, after he was trained for 8 months at Fort Bliss, he was stationed at the Presidio Army Base. Of course, the last known Zodiac victim, Paul Stine, was killed in Presidio Heights, just south of this army base, which was also just blocks away from where he was working at the time at 3333 California Street, which is just 3 blocks east and 3 blocks south of the Presidio Heights crime scene. Sorry, that's a lot of threes. But Klingel was working on California Street in Laurel Heights, San Francisco, and he was working there Monday through Friday. And most of the Zodiac Killer letters were sent on weekdays in San Francisco, and I'm thinking he'd be sending these to and from work. There is one letter that the Zodiac sent that was not sent in San Francisco. It was sent in a town called Pleasanton. And this is the aforementioned LA Times letter, which was sent March 13th, 1971. It had an AM postmark. Now, Chester Klingel frequently visited his in-laws in Turlock, California. Pleasanton is directly en route from his home at 366 Marin Ave, Mill Valley, to his in-laws' house in Houston. Or if this is on a Saturday morning, my thinking is he could have dropped this off on his way to go and visit his in-laws. Because Klingel is somebody who drove around quite a bit. As I mentioned already, he would go to his in-laws' house, which was over an hour away from his house, and he did this frequently. He was also a fisherman, and he would take fishing trips. And I wonder, could he have fished on Lake Berryessa? Could he have fished on Lake Herman? It certainly seems to be within the normal range of where he would drive, but we don't have any concrete information that those were places where he was known to fish. But the Zodiac Killer seems to have potentially been a fisherman as well. He had a wooden knife sheath, and wooden knife sheaths are used by fishermen who are used to going into the water. Of course, as I mentioned before, there's also an attack at Lake Berryessa, an attack near Lake Herman, and an attack at Blue Rock Springs. And even the attack at Blue Rock Springs is near Lake Herman, and Lake Herman and Lake Berryessa are both popular fishing locations. Of course, the other attack is in Presidio Heights, which, as I mentioned, is right by where he was stationed in the Army. It's right by where he was working at the time. So I think within reason we can say that Chester Klingel was capable of having connections to these geographic locations. Something else about the Zodiac Killer is that he seems to have knowledge of musical theater, or at the very least, he quotes from some Gilbert and Sullivan productions. And Chester Klingel is somebody who grew up around theater. His mother would put on shows frequently at their house, and his sister was on Broadway, and she had moved away all the way to New York to go and be on Broadway. Klingel also attended the Rhubarb Revue in Mill Valley, which took place at 203 Marin Ave, which was just minutes away from his home at 366 Marin Ave. And the Rhubarb Revue was, and still is, sort of this variety act comedy show, and it's a lot of satirical comedy, parodies of TV, parodies of popular culture and television and movies. They were known for making irreverent jokes. One that I was able to find was, "I prayed to God to give me a bicycle, but then I remembered, he doesn't work like that, so I stole a bicycle and asked him for forgiveness." That kind of stuff. The Master of Ceremonies wore these ridiculous fake mustaches that in one case was apparently made out of horsehair. And you can see he kind of has this Groucho Marx look to him with the big old mustache and the hat and the cigar. But I haven't directly been able to find that they parodied any Gilbert and Sullivan productions or anything like that. But I do think Chester Klingel definitely has a connection to musical theater through his family. So to summarize, he has firearms knowledge, potentially some sewing abilities. He has a heightened level of electronics knowledge. He'd be familiar with ammonium nitrate fertilizer. He has a connection to Mount Diablo, probably familiar with celestial navigation. He has some connections to the Philippines. He was stationed at the Presidio Army Base, worked just blocks away from the Stein crime scene. He had reason to be in San Francisco enough to be sending the letters on weekdays. And he also had reason to be passing through Pleasanton when the LA Times letter was sent. He was a fisherman who could have been familiar with Lake Berryessa and Lake Herman, and he has these connections to musical theater. As I just realized that I haven't brought up coding at all, I am somebody who believes that the Zodiac Killer was self-taught when it comes to coding. Some people say that the Zodiac Killer couldn't be self-taught because the 340 was so complicated. I would just say, as somebody who is self-taught and makes codes for fun myself, it is very easy for an amateur to accidentally make their cipher so exponentially more complicated by adding just 2 or 3 steps to make it essentially unsolvable. So I believe that the Zodiac Killer, Klingel or not, was self-taught when it comes to coding. But let me know what you guys think about these points that I've laid out, and thank you for listening. Have a nice day.